So I'll start by saying that I talked with Lee about what she'd like to hear about, and she said, oh, tell us about personal things that we don't know about. And then interestingly enough, she said, and maybe you could talk about the outside in my own view of success and my greatest challenges and failure. And she didn't say this philosophy of life and science. I just threw that in. But let me say that the first one will take about 95% of the time, and the rest will fly through. So I think when you talk about a person's life, there are two things you're interested in. The people that have really affected them and their environment. And I was fortunate enough to grow up in Montana. And Montana's an interesting state. So the western third looks like this. It's the Rocky Mountains, beautiful country and everything. And I lived 2/3 of my life in Montana on the west. The middle is rolling hills. I lived the remaining third in Montana there. And then the west is flat and boring. But the mountains really had an impact on me, as you'll see, because I very much got into mountaineering and later into technical climbing. So Montana was special, I think, in really three ways: the environment and where it took me. But I think the other thing is it's really a small state. So when I left there, it had 600,000 people. Today, it just reached 1 million, and it meant every place was pretty small. And what's special about that is you can participate in a lot of things when you live in small places that you can't in big places. And in fact, I remember having lunch with this fellow who ran a company that specialized in figuring out really difficult problems. And I asked him, where do people come from that can solve really difficult problems? And he said they came from two places. One, small towns and places like you grew up in, or two, really big competitive places like New York City. He said, I never found anyone that was very worthwhile from middle suburbia. So I thought that was a very interesting interesting comment. The final comment is a bit facetious too. I mean, Montana's an infinitely red state, and I never figured out why we have all these fantastic liberal senators across the years. I mean, really, really unusual. And it's relevant to my life because actually it was a reasonable period of time early in my scientific career when I thought I'd really like to quit science, go to Montana and become a senator. Now, what changed my mind completely is understanding how politics work and getting involved with lobbying and saying, God, would I want to be on the other side of the fence? And the answer was absolutely not. So the people in my life that initially really impacted me were obviously my immediate family. My father was an incredibly intriguing person. He grew up in a family where he was horribly abused, to the point he ran away in middle high school. He put himself through high school and through college. And I think that was a spectacular achievement. He was an incredibly stubborn individual because he came within one course of getting a degree in electrical engineering at the University of Montana. And that one course was French. And he said to his mentor, why do I need French to understand electrical engineering? He said, on principle, I'm not going to take it. He never got a degree, so he joined the American Mountain States Telephone Company, starting at the very lowest level, and he worked up to become a high-level executive. He was incredibly smart. He was incredibly focused on his work, to the point, for example, that he didn't go either to my college or my medical school graduation. But he did give me one thing that was really invaluable, and that was I think the summer of my sophomore, maybe my junior year in high school, he took me down to a teaching institution for Mountain States in Colorado, and he taught a series of courses there on basic electronics and systems design and things. And he requested that I take those courses. Now, I think he wanted me to take the courses to show off to his men that I was really smart. And I really resented that. I didn't want to do that, but I did. He was a pretty intimidating character. But I'll tell you, those courses changed how I thought about biology, and they changed how I thought about technology. So it was actually an incredible gift. My mother actually got a degree. She got a degree from the same university in home ec. My mother grew up on a ranch. She grew up as an only child, and she felt that she never had the independence to get out and really do things. So my mother was all about making sure that her kids were independent-minded and weren't suppressed in any ways. I'll say both my mother and my father had really strong feelings about academic performance, and they let us know in no uncertain terms that they had high expectations. I think my mother really suffered what a lot of women at that time suffered, namely she was enormously intelligent and talented, and she felt she could do much more than she did, although she was a wonderful homemaker and was terrific for us. My brother Myron was 3 years behind me, and Doral was a single year behind me. I actually called them both up and said, "What do you remember about the early days?" And my sister immediately said, "I'll bet you've forgotten that I got better grades than you did for the first couple of years." And I said, "Yeah, I had forgotten that." My sister was really a wonderful person. She became a nurse and a nursing supervisor. And she's kind of the center of the Hood family now. She's one of these people who's always thinking about organizing and how to do things. She married an absolutely fascinating man who knew all about cars. They actually did gold mining in Alaska for a number of years. So he was a really interesting character, and they have absolutely a terrific family. And the same is true of my younger brother Myron. He became a mathematician and was a terrific teacher, first at Occidental and then more recently at Cal Poly. And he has just a marvelous, if on occasion slightly crude, sense of humor. But it is actually delightful. One of the heritages that our family has is the last three Hoods, my father, his father, and his father, all died of heart attacks somewhere between 50 and 69, and my brother actually a few years ago had a triple bypass. I feel in great shape so far, and but it was a wonderful constraint. 9 years after I was born, my mother had Glenn, her last son, and Glenn turned out to have Down syndrome. And Glenn was significant in my life in two ways. One, we didn't know about chromosomes back in those days, and I really did wonder what it meant to have that kind of disease. And that was one of the things that got me early on interested in biology. But the second thing was an enormous family argument that arose over Glenn between my mother and my father. My father's position was that Glenn would be much better off in a state school. My mother's position was that she wanted Glenn to stay and be a part of the family. And in the end, my father won. And I have to say, I think that was the right decision for Glenn. He went to a terrific school. He ended up probably being in the upper 1% of the Downs kids. He actually owned his own house at one time and had 3 jobs. So, I mean, he was, you wonder what he would have been like without the extra chromosome. And in fact, most Downs children die really early, and he lived up into his 60s before he actually died. And Roy Wadsworth was my maternal grandfather, and he was a character right out of a book. He could do anything. He was a carpenter, a stonemason, a road builder. He drove stagecoach in Yellowstone Park. He hunted for many years. He guided people in fishing. And he built a summer camp that played a big role in my life that I'll talk about later. He never had a son, so I was his son, and he was a terrific father to me. In fact, in my family, he was the only one that spoiled me, and that was very special. But we'll return to some other things that he gave me a little later on. So what about preschool? Preschool, I was in Missoula, Montana, and it was absolutely a wonderful place to grow up as a kid. There was enormous freedom. It wasn't a very large town at that time, 15,000 or so. But what was very special about the summers of my preschool year is that we spent those with my grandfather down at his ranch. And his ranch was in the Beartooth Mountains of southwestern Montana. And in fact, this picture looks very much like the land around there. So I learned how to be a rancher and farmer, but he gave us enormous freedom for running around the mountains, and that's where I think got my earliest love of mountaineering and so forth. So elementary school was a big shock because my father, again, very much driven by his career, moved us at a variety of different times. And he moved us to the worst place he ever moved for the first grade, and that was Ramsey, Montana. So Ramsey, Montana was on the edge of this enormously polluted city of Butte, big copper mine there and everything. And it was flat, and Ramsey couldn't have had 200 people. It had maybe 25 houses, and it was really a dump. So going there after Missoula was really depressing. But the enormously important thing that happened is they had a single-room schoolhouse. So it was marvelous being able to hear lessons for all the different kids. So we all got to learn everything, and that was a great experience. And of course, we were there for 1 year, and he did his telephone business, whatever that was. And then fortunately, we moved back to Missoula. And in Missoula, we stayed at 1301 Vine. And that house was nestled right at the flank of a mountain called Mount Jumbo. And it was a terrific place for a young person to run around. And in fact, what was really cool is you could go up on the edge of the mountain and take a trail and go to Prescott Grade School, which is where I went to the second grade. And my experiences there were interesting. In the second grade, I ran into Miss George, who was one of the strictest disciplinarians I've ever run into in my life. And she actually really taught me that in school you had to work. That is, at least if you were going to live up to her expectations. So I found her class an enormously exhilarating one. Also at that school was a janitor called Mr. Jackman. And he taught me music lessons. I started out playing the piano and then switched to the clarinet. And then finally, for most of the rest of my elementary and grade school, I played the oboe. And I liked music. But Mr. Jackman loved to teach music theory, which I didn't really like, but it was really useful later on, just knowing about it. So it was a terrific kind of experience. But maybe the most life-determining event happened when I got in a discussion with my fourth grade math teacher, Mr. Graham. So for all of my earlier existence, I had wanted to be a pilot. I thought being a pilot was the coolest possible thing in the world. And Mr. Graham said, I hear you're interested in being a pilot. And I said, yeah, I was really excited about that. He said, let me tell you what it's like to be a pilot. He said, I drove B-17s during World War II across Burma. And he said, driving a plane is exactly like driving a truck. He said, would you like to spend the rest of your life driving a truck? And I've never had an argument that convinced me so quickly that I made a major decision. But the fallout I never knew until I talked to my sister again recently was she hated him for the next year because she thought her brother being a pilot would really be glamorous. So the spin-outs, the fallouts, you can never tell about. My father was moved to north central Montana, Shelby, Montana, to build a whole series of microwave repeater stations all the way across northern Montana. So we were disrupted and pulled up to Shelby just in time for me to start high school there. And it was a terrific experience, and I got involved in so many things in Shelby High School, some of which I'll talk about. But certainly one of the most fundamental was I'd always liked sports. Although when I was a freshman, I weighed 105 pounds. And when I graduated as a senior, I weighed 173 pounds. So that was quite a transition. But we had a football team that my last 3.5 years was undefeated. We won the Class B championships, and I was halfback and quarterback the first couple of years, and then my senior year I was quarterback of the team. And what was exciting about being a quarterback, apart from the physicality of playing football, was strategy. I loved to figure out what you had to do, and it was just a great experience. But in high school, I had 3 of the best teachers I ever had in my entire career. And you know, the liberation of women has led to one really unfortunate thing. Before they were liberated, there were these wonderful old maid teachers that were absolutely terrific. And Miss Corley Dunster was one of them. She taught social studies and history, and she was gruff and really smart and very challenging. I remember she said once to me my senior year that, and you know, I never figured out why she said this to me until it was much later. She said, I just want to tell you, you're not the smartest student I've ever had, but she said, you'll probably be the most successful. And, you know, that made absolutely no sense to me at the time, but I think I really understand what she means now. The second teacher, Mr. Paul Shockey, was a to-be doctor that decided he would teach for 2 or 3 years to make enough money to go back to medical school, and he never went back. He loved teaching and was a terrific math teacher. And he taught me debate, and I'll say a little bit more about debate later on. And the teacher who influenced my life in the greatest way was Cliff Olson, who was a chemistry teacher. And one thing he did was he said, my senior year, would you like to help me teach freshman biology? And I said, oh, that'd be great if I could teach out of Scientific American. He said, fine. So I taught, I don't know, 8 courses or something like that. And one of them was a 1956 Scientific American article on the structure of DNA. And that really made me realize that my thoughts about being a geologist maybe weren't so good. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. I wanted to think seriously about being a geologist. So debate. Mr. Shockey gave me 2 great pieces of advice when I started debate. One is, he said, never use notes. You always need to look at your opponents and the judges in their eyes. He said that's the only way to effectively communicate, and if you're mumbling into your notes, no one listens to you. So that was, the second piece of advice was also really very good too. And he said, in debate, there are infinite numbers of arguments about how you deal with various issues. And he said the key thing is to modularize them so you can organize in many, many different ways, combinations of arguments that can be very effective. And once you get used to that, then you can modularize your talks in really effective ways so you can give them with ease and so forth. So debate was really terrific for me. So we made it to the state finals my last 2 years. Junior year, we debated and we knew we'd lost. Too bad. Senior year, we debated and we knew we'd won. In fact, our opponents came over and congratulated us, but the judges chose otherwise. One of the most depressing experiences of my life. So acting, I was in all the class plays, and I really love to just get out and be someone else. And the combination of debate and acting brought us to Missoula, Montana every year for the big, it was a track meet put together with the clam meet. And so at this particular meet, my junior year, I was in a play, and I played a henpecked husband, and I got a gold medal for my acting. And it's where I first met Valerie. Valerie saw me in that play and decided I was typecast. And this was the person for her. And what was even more spectacular is when we had the big dance the second night or whenever it was, and there were 200 girls all sitting around, I went over and unerringly picked Valerie out. And that was the beginning of a romance that lasted, as she said, even longer than Tennyson's. We were married 8 years later, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But it was, serendipity really plays an important role in the trajectory of your lives. And I'm going to talk about serendipity right at the end of the lecture. Beartooth Camp was built again on the flank of the mountains in southwestern Beartooth Mountains by my granddad, and it was a camp where faculty and students from Princeton, Harvard, Yale, Columbia used to come and do their theses and run summer courses. So it was really, I spent 3 years there, and it was really an exciting place in several ways. One, for the first time, I met real scientists that knew what science was about, and it was kind of intimidating. But the second thing that was really interesting is there would be, I don't know, 200 people gathered at the camp, and we had, my granddad had built this magnificent dining room and everything, and they would gather around at the end of the dinners, and people would tell stories, and my granddad was the best storyteller of all. Everyone listened to him, and I mean, he could have been a great actor and everything. The final thing that really affected me is one of the courses I took was, well, I learned how to do geologic mapping by working with people doing their PhD theses, and then I used that skill to go down and, as part of a course, map an oil anticline in Wyoming, and I used that project as my project for the Westinghouse Science Talent Search. And you had to have a project, and you had to take a test, and 40 people in the US got to go, and I was one of the 40 that got to go. Only the second one from the state of Montana. And it was enormously venturesome from 2 points of view. One, I really had never been out of the state before, so going by myself on a train all the way to Washington, D.C. was absolutely an incredible kind of experience. And getting to Washington, D.C. and meeting all these infinitely smart other kids was kind of a downer because, gee, I thought I was really, really smart until I ran into some of those kids. But on the other hand, I met a lifelong friend, John Campbell, then, and actually John's younger sister, Catherine, worked here up until last year or so, and I met Catherine actually when she was 12 years old. So the Westinghouse Science Talent was, it made me realize how big and diverse and marvelous the world was. But the final seminal experience, and this again is serendipity, is Mr. Olson, actually, my chemistry teacher, had been a meteorologist during World War II, and as a part of his meteorology training, he'd gone to Caltech for 2 years, and he decided any really good students he got, he would send to Caltech. So my junior year, he started working on me about Caltech, which I'd never, ever in a million years heard of. And besides, I wanted to go to a good liberal arts school and get a broad education and not a narrow technical education. But Cliff Olson was utterly relentless. And in the end, my last argument was, look, you have to take the advanced math test, and that's mostly calculus, and we haven't had any calculus. And he said, you'll do okay. So anyway, I took it and got in Caltech. I suspect my advanced math scores were among the lowest they'd ever let into Caltech, but anyway, it was absolutely a marvelous kind of decision. Caltech was really an interesting place. For a variety of reasons we won't go into, my father gave me an old car we had, and I drove to Caltech all by myself. So you're going to someplace new, and I had some fear and some trepidation about what it was all going to be like. As I drove into Pasadena, my eyes started stinging, and I wondered, what in the world is this? I'd never heard of smog. And in fact, the smog was so bad, it was 3 weeks before you could see the San Gabriel Mountains that were immediately to the north. And that was particularly hard because I played football at Caltech again, and bad exercise and bad smog is really a terrifically terrible kind of combination. When I went to Caltech, it was culture shock, the likes of which I've never experienced before. I remember walking in and meeting my first assigned roommate, and he said to me, "What do you think about tensor analysis?" And I said, "Gee, I don't even know what it is." And he said, "You're really going to have trouble here." And I was beginning to agree with him after I talked with some other people. But I'll tell you, he flunked out in the first quarter. And it wasn't because he wasn't smart. He was infinitely smart. It's because he played bridge 20 hours a day and could not escape from playing bridge. But anyway, I was a survivor. But what happened is a lot of the Caltech students were these prep school kids who'd had, you know, the first 2 years of math and the first year of physics. So they were just coasting through all of these things. But so it was an interesting challenge. I had 2 classes of teachers that were really interesting. Those that were mere mortals, like Ray Owen, who taught me immunology, who was a wonderful, open person. He was the first faculty member to have me and other freshmen over to his house and really introduced us to Caltech in a most marvelous way. And Ray remained my mentor through many of my 3 different interactions with Caltech. And James Bonner was another faculty member that played a key role in my decision to go to Hopkins to medical school. The other 2 teachers were absolutely spectacular heroes. So Richard Feynman and Linus Pauling. And what was incredible about their teaching was how beautifully conceptual it was, how devoid it was of all the pap that most of your undergraduate courses had of people telling you all about what they really knew everything about and you'd forget about in 6 months. But I think Pauling and Feynman really inspired me and got me excited about teaching. Caltech was famous for pranks, and my Caltech prank was getting together with 3 of my friends, one of whom had an old Model T Ford, and deciding we'd stage a mock bank robbery. And the idea was that we'd put on these coats with bulging pockets, and we walked into the bank, which was the corner of Colorado and Lake, center of Pasadena. And I would walk up and down the bank and then go over to a certain teller and would slip a little note out of my pocket on the floor, and then we all walked out, got in our Model T and drove off. And the note had a picture of the drawing of the interior of a bank with a big X at the teller's cage I'd gone to. And then the idea was, and we did this, come back in about 3 days and walk in the same outfit and everything. And what we were supposed to do is I had a $250 check, which I was going to cash, sweep into a basketball bag, throw across the door. They were going to catch it, and then we were going to say, "Let's go," and run out. But what happened, the second I walked in the door, a guard came up and started walking behind me. So I went down to one end and the other end, and he followed me all the way. And then I went over to the cage, and she refused to cash the check. And I was supposed to throw the bag anyway, and I swore everyone in the bank was looking at me, so I just walked out. My friends were just furious that I hadn't carried it off. The next day, I was called into the dean's office, and there was an FBI agent there that said, "Tell me what you've been doing for the last week." And it turned out that 4 people had been robbing banks in the LA area that vaguely, I don't think very close, fit our description. And he said, if you'd run, it's very likely one or more of you have been shot, because they were really ready for you. So I have good taste. You have to remember that. And then we had to go to the police chiefs, and he said, I would be personally responsible for any pranks that came out of Caltech that year. We had a great next one, but we never pulled it off. So Eric Adelberger was my roommate for 4 years. He's actually a physicist here at the University of Washington, and he's what all undergraduate roommates are all about. It's long discussions about philosophy and science, and we did a lot of activities together. In fact, Eric was a real greenhorn Easterner. And so the way we introduced him into mountaineering, I said, well, would you like to go climb San Jacinto from the Palm Springs side? Now, what that means is you have 7,000 vertical feet, and it's not difficult climbing, but it is a hell of a hike. And he said, sure. And I said, okay, wear good shoes. And he got there, and he had these loafers on. I said, Eric, he said, oh, let's just go. And so we did it, but his shoes were in tatters, and his feet were in tatters by the time he finished. But he loved it, and we were lifelong mountaineer friends, and I'll show you some of that a little bit later on. Our home field in football was the Rose Bowl, so I played in the Rose Bowl 16 times. And it was really quite an experience to play in front of an audience of 50 in a stadium that holds 105,000. You kind of had to listen to hear them give a cheer. So I decided that at Caltech I had a terrific background in math and science. I knew everything there was to know about viruses and microbes, but I knew nothing about human biology. So I decided I'd go to medical school, and I debated between Harvard and Johns Hopkins, and James Bonner said, oh, it's no contest. You should go to Hopkins for 2 reasons. One, he said, it's infinitely more flexible. And 2, he said, they have this special program where you can finish in 2.5 or 3 years if you don't want to go on and be an MD. And I just wanted to learn the human biology and go back and get a degree. So I went off to Johns Hopkins Medical School. And, you know, I'd only been east once before. And I will tell you, going to Johns Hopkins in August, where the temperature and the humidity were 100 or greater for 5 days in a row, made me realize how fantastic the West is. And the weather went downhill from there. Hopkins was a really interesting place. The medical school was set in the middle of a ghetto. It was really a dangerous place to be. And you had to be very careful in just going from the hall, the living hall, over to the hospital itself and so forth. But it was a marvelous experience. We took biochemistry from Al Leninger when he was writing his classic textbooks, getting the chapters one at a time, and kind of, it was really fun talking to him. I actually took some physical chemistry and other courses over at Homewood campus, and I got to really love lacrosse. They had championship teams all the time, and I went to lots and lots of the lacrosse games and so forth. And as I was finishing up, I was amazed to see the professor of medicine, of psychiatry, and of pediatrics all come and try and persuade me to stay on and do an internship and residency. And of course, it was quite easy to say no. What was far more difficult to say no to is Barry Wood, who is one of the grand old men of science. He was at one time the youngest chair of medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. Asked me if I would like to get a job in microbiology there after I got my PhD, and I knew I didn't want to live in Baltimore. So I had to say no to somebody who was a real god. And of course, there was the whole question of where to go next. So I looked among a lot of different schools, but what absolutely sold me on going back to Caltech is the thing I got most excited about in medical school was immunology. And in fact, I did this big, really great paper on theories of antibody diversity, and they were instructionistic, Linus Pauling's approach, and selectionistic, Burnett's approach. And it turned out at Caltech, Bill Dreyer was there, and he was working on Bence-Jones proteins and myeloma proteins, and I'd read all about them and knew about them. And so I went out and saw him, and he said, "This is really a great Saturday afternoon project. It's one that's good for a graduate student because no one is interested in it but you, as far as I can tell." So I said, "Okay, that's fine. I'll go to Caltech and all." But the most important thing that happened in graduate school was marrying Valerie. After these 8 long years, we decided we would get married. And it was cool because we had really good friends in Pasadena and really good friends in Montana. So how do you solve that paradox? Well, you solve it by having 2 weddings. So we had a wedding in Pasadena and then an affirmation in Cut Bank, Montana. Now, the fly in the ointment was the minister in Cut Bank, Montana got enormously angry when he heard it wasn't a real wedding, it was only an affirmation. But fortunately, he just let slip that he was a football player, so I talked football with him. And after 10 minutes, we got it all straightened out, and we were properly affirmed and everything. But it was a terrific life decision. And all sorts of great things have come from that. So Bill Dreyer, my mentor, was an incredible character. He gave me some of the basic philosophies I'll mention a little bit later. He was very much a theoretical biologist, and he was an innovative genius in thinking about new technologies. He really came up with some of the most interesting applications of hybridomas in the very earliest days and how you could use antibodies. And he developed an amino acid sequencer and had this point of view: if you want to change a field in science, invent a new technology. But so we had really enjoyable conversations. I got started on this incredible project in molecular immunology, which involved taking a gazillion BALB/c mice and generating myeloma tumors and purifying from the mice the proteins and starting to sequence these things and all. And one of the real crises in my life came about halfway through my 2nd year when Bill came up to me and said, "The major project in the lab has failed for technical reasons. I have 2 postdocs that I've got to get quick papers so they can go out and get jobs. I'm taking your project away and you'll have to figure out something else to do." And so we had this enormous battle that lasted an hour, and I didn't go down easily, but in the end, it was his lab. And in the end, it turned out all for the best because you can always figure out things to do. And I did things that were more interesting than that, wrote straightforward kind of stuff of sequencing all these tumors and everything. So it all worked out for the best. I took English and philosophy courses. Caltech had no required courses, so you could do what you wanted to do. And of course, I learned about technical climbing in graduate school. And what was great about technical climbing in graduate school was you could go for a weekend and it combined two properties. One, enormous physicality. You really had to be in great shape, and it was, but it was wonderful problem solving. And putting the two of those things together, you just forgot about all that, those experiments that weren't working, and you came back with a fresh slate, all ready to go. As I was finishing up at Caltech, I got a job offer from Berkeley. That was really easy to turn down because I wanted to go to England and Henry Harris and work on somatic cell genetics, but my draft board said, no, the Vietnam War's on, we need doctors in Vietnam, and I said, but I don't have a license, and they said, you can go to the battlefield and do just R&D kind of stuff, helping out. And I said, oh, okay. So I went to NIH instead as an alternative, and was actually a senior investigator there. So I skipped to PhD. I got to set my own lab up, do molecular immunology. It was a tremendous learning experience. And what was also great about Caltech, NIH at that time was all of the really great scientists who were to go on to be the leaders of American medicine were there. So I got to know the leaders for the next 40 years in American medicine just in that 3-year period that I was there. I taught a bunch of courses, and it made me realize, NIH tried very hard to get me to stay, but again, I wanted to go back east. But even more so, they were very conservative about technology. They weren't really interested in it, so I wanted to go find some interesting place that might have real interest in technology. So I looked at a bunch of different places. It was funny. I remember going to Harvard Medical School biochemistry, and they offered me a really nice job there. And Mario Capecchi, who was later a Nobel Prize winner from Utah, who had a lab there, said, let me talk to you about this department. And so we sat down and he said, do you know that the chairman of biochemistry has a bigger bathroom than I have a lab? And that kind of epitomized some of Harvard for me, so it was easy to say no. The big debate was between Stanford and Caltech, and so Stanford offered me the enormous salary of $20,000 a year, Caltech $15,000 a year, so I went to the chairman at Caltech and said, look, Stanford has offered me this $5,000 more than you. Do you think there's any possibility you can adjust it? And he said, no. He said, you'll just have to decide what's important to you. And I thought that was such a great answer. And actually it was very easy to decide to go to Caltech. I should have said that one of the other major things that happened back at NIH when I was in the public health service, which is the military, you get free babies there. So we got 2 free babies. We got Aaron and Marquis, who were absolutely terrific kids. And there's Aaron at the NIH days, and there's Marquis. So anyway, so back to Caltech then. I was on the faculty then for the next 22 years at Caltech. And I'll just say a few things. At Caltech, we really learned how to climb and mountaineer. Eric and I did enormous kinds of things. And in fact, here's bragging. Here's Aaron climbing a pitch in Yosemite that is very similar to the major accomplishment, physical accomplishment in my life. And that is climbing the nose of El Cap, which was a 22-hour climb, and we did it without protection, so you could do it very fast. And it was at an extreme level of difficulty, and I climbed it with a guy who was about twice as good as I, So he led all the really, really difficult parts. And I remember we started at 2, and I remember getting up to the top at pitch dark and just laying on a rock. But it was absolutely exhilarating to be able to do that for 22 hours. And I suspect I couldn't even do the first pitch today. It's really depressing. Don't get old. Yeah. Climbing mountains has enormous benefits, as you can see here. And here's my greatest defeat in mountaineering. Eric and I had 2 goes at the Matterhorn. One, the snow was way too deep. We tried to climb it, but we ran into some people who said, it's really dangerous higher up. Even if you're in good shape, you don't want to try this. So we went down. And then the second time, the weather was so bad that it never cleared. But what an absolutely magnificent mountain. Valerie and I climbed Mount Rainier when we were at Caltech, getting a warm-up for coming up here. And here's Mount Rainier at the top. Again, you start at 2 o'clock in the morning, and we were up on top by 9, and it was absolutely beautiful, gorgeous weather. You could see all the way down to Mount Shasta in California. It was really, really spectacular. So we took our kids camping early. So this is a climbing trip to the minarets in the Sierras. Marquis was 3 months, and Aaron was a little more than 2. And the most hilarious part of it was the younger, and we had friends that had a young breastfeeding baby too, when 2 of us climbers had to be there with the breastfeeding babies with no breasts. So bottled milk had to suffice. But anyway, it broke them in early, and they're both really terrific mountaineers. I mean, Aaron is better in everything than I am right now. One of the big experiences we had at Caltech is for about 20 years in a row, every spring we'd go to the Grand Canyon and go down a different canyon, either from the north or from the south. So we've hiked all over the Grand Canyon, and it's absolutely magnificent kind of country. Aspen played a very special role because I did a lot of teaching at Caltech, and we converted the teaching into books. I've written now 7 textbooks, but we started writing them at Aspen. There was a writing center Benjamin Cummings ran, and we liked Aspen so well that with Bill and Poots Woods, we bought a house there and had it for about 20 years. And our kids in the summer, we'd go there for 6 weeks or so and write, and the kids would play. And Aaron learned how to play tennis and how to fish and how to do all sorts of things. So Aspen was a very, very special place. And we took lots of family trips. Here is one to Japan, and had the interesting experience going then and having the Japanese hosts say that there are going to be 2 separate banquets each night, one for the men and one for the women. And so I really didn't like that. So I said, I'll go to the banquet with the women so I can be with my wife. So they made an exception, and Valerie got to go to the banquet for the men. And I figured I'd let the other men deal with whether their wives would go or not. Valerie was served by a geisha. It was terrific. And we went to China in 1983 and saw all of China. I mean, that's the Great Wall. This is the River Lee and all these fantastic mountains. So it was a wonderful family trip again. So Caltech, as many of you know, I left because I wanted to do things biology wasn't interested in. And Bill Gates made it possible to move to the University of Washington. And again, I had to leave the University of Washington. You see a pattern here. Because I wanted to do things that the university bureaucracy couldn't deal with. And of course, that's exactly how ISB got started. So, career assessments. I would say these are probably the things that many people would say I did that were singular accomplishments. And You all know about all of these things. I don't really need to say very much about them. My own view of accomplishments, I think, the students I've had and what they've done is, I think that's the surest sign of success in an academic kind of career. The excitement of building ventures, molecular biotechnology, ISB companies and things like that. Ventures with Valerie and many others through the K through 12 science education have been terribly important to both of us. Teaching innovative courses and writing these textbooks was important, and these 4 paradigm changes that led to the 5th, namely systems medicine and P4 medicine, I think has been important. And obviously inventing the automated sequencer and solving problems of immune diversity and founding these companies were things I would put among those. I think the greatest challenge in my career has always been resistance on the part of people to new kinds of ideas. So the really interesting question is, what is my biggest failure? And I would say many people would say it's the inability to work effectively to change classic academic systems. And you know, that's really an interesting point to understand. My argument is, for any real paradigm change, you can only begin to realize it by creating a new structure. Now, if you can create the new structure within the institution, that's okay, but a lot of times you can't do it. And if you stay within the institution and pound away at it and doing it, you end up compromising enormously, and you'll get far less done than if you'd done it the right way and created a new institution. Now, I'm all about fundamentally changing the healthcare system, and here you have to work with the healthcare system, but how you work with it is the really important point. What kind of new structures can we infuse into the healthcare system that will catalyze the revolution? So my next big goal is this 100K wellness project. It's the very essence of P4 medicine, and it's going to improve healthcare and reduce costs and promote innovation and discovery. And I think there's a wonderful chance for a wellness company that will be the foundation of a whole new industry and so forth. Okay, advice to students. Now, I have a lot of advice because I've been around a long time, but I would say the first thing is you really have to have fun. Don't do anything that isn't fun. I would say work at the leading edge. This is what Bill Dreyer always said. It's more fun there. If you want to transform a field, invent a new technology. I think for all of us, cross-disciplinary training, learning the other languages is really critical. How do we get people to think outside the box? That's actually one of my favorite topics, but we don't have time to discuss it here. Computational training to deal with big data is going to be essential. Learning to work together effectively in teams. I think determined optimism is absolutely the heart of being able to push through new, big, different kinds of ideas. And at the same time, you have to have real passion because you have to be able to sell your ideas too. Risk-taking, I think, is essential for anybody who wants to do big things, and that's hard to do. It's lifelong, the learning is and everything, and change your career every 10 years so you keep fresh and everything. And now the point about serendipity. Take advantage of serendipity. So my point is, a lot of our life is like a little random walk kind of thing, but on occasion, serendipity makes an orthogonal change in direction and may propel the magnitude of where you are off in a different kind of direction. So I would say I've had 2 serendipitous events in my life that really changed what I became. So one was Cliff Olson and sending me to Caltech. Look, I could have gone to Harvard or a good liberal arts school, but I would have really been different. And I think I like me now better than what I can extrapolate I would have been like then. And I think the second big serendipitous event was when the dean who hired me at the University of Washington and promised to build a systems thing died, and the new dean came in and said, he didn't quite say he wasn't interested, but he certainly made it impossible. So I think taking advantage of serendipity is really an important thing. And it's key in determining our life, and it's really interesting to ask, what serendipitous events have placed you where you are right now? And I would finally say, I think the missions of an academic are fourfold. So scholarship, education, transferring knowledge to society, and community leadership. And this is really an interesting area, and it obviously can mean many, many different things. So I've had a terrific career. I wouldn't change it for the world. And one of what all of us have built here at ISB and the opportunities that we have for the future in changing the world. Thank you.